So my role this afternoon or morning, as the case may be, is to just provide a little bit of organizational context on USAON, the interagency group, and its role within this National Committee to the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Program, or SAON, and as well just talk a little bit about progress and what we are working on and looking for in the current fiscal year. So just as a refresher, I don't have slides today, so I'm just gonna make some brief remarks. Hopefully we'll be rolling out a communication strategy later on that provides additional resources and information. But for the time being, I just want to refresh everyone, or perhaps educate new folks if they aren't familiar with SAON or with the USAON Interagency Group and its structure and its role. But there are several reasons or sort of motivating factors that led to the creation of the USAON group, the interagency body. And one, just to minimize confusion, I also serve as program director for the Arctic Observing Network funding program at the National Science Foundation, which is related, but is very, it's a distinct entity. And so ignore any sort of thinking about this as a funding program, but really more as a coordinating body. That was based on a couple of previous efforts that included very early on a National Sciences Academy report back in 2006 or 2007, if not mistaken, that provided some recommendations towards developing an integrated Arctic observing network, as well as further activities, including an external review of SAON. SAON is a sort of jointly managed initiative through the Arctic Council and the International Arctic Science Committee, also with the effort of the intent of coordinating Arctic observing activities and data. And back in 2016, there was an external review of SAON, which called for, among other things, creation of national coordination committees for participating nations. And this was intended to also develop some guidelines, mandates, terms of reference, and related aspects, so that there was clearer and consistent messaging and coordination among the participating nations. Related to that, also, under the current Iarpic five-year research plan that spans, that started in fiscal year 2017 and goes on until this year, 21. Research objective 9.1, for those of you who aren't familiar with the plan intimately, basically stood up USAON as an implementing body to enhance multi-agency and outside collaborations and participations in new and existing activities to improve both best practices, coordination, and synthesis of observations towards a fully integrated USAON. And if you also sort of review the plan carefully, you'll note, many of you will note that there are about 16 other research objectives sprinkled throughout the different chapters that apply to different collaboration teams that implement that. So that's a little bit about the background. In addition, sort of more recently in 2017, there was a report by the Science and Technology Policy Institute, or STIPI, that opened up international Arctic that promoted an international Arctic observations framework around societal benefit areas. And that has been part of the basis of how USAON is moving forward. So a couple of things to bring up to speed to this group is that after a number of years, despite sort of a bit of high turnover among some of the board members within the USAON group, the interagency group, we are developing terms of reference to really sort of be more explicit and clear on the different roles and the responsibilities of the body. And the way we've done this thus far as a board is basically adapted the SAON terms of reference, so the international body, and modified it for our particular needs. So among other things, these terms of reference are intended to clearly outline the goals of the USAON, so that we are very certain about what our expectations are, as well as describing the structure, the roles and responsibilities of different sub-bodies. And as a reminder, aside from a USAON board, which is Fed only, we have the Arctic Observing Arctic Observing Systems sub-team that brings in a wider group of stakeholders and end users to Arctic observing frameworks, approaches, and methodologies. And it really also, the terms of reference also gives us a sense of the relationships that the USAON board has explicitly with SAON as well as with Iarpic. And I think even for my part, even though I've been involved in US AON activities the last several years since my appointment at NSF, and also serving sort of dual roles along with folks like Kenny Starkweather and Kathy Kuhn, a colleague from BOEM, whether it's being a national representative to SAON or within our own funding agencies in Iarpic, it's really, I think, behooves us to have clear and consistent messaging, because it's not always crystal clear how these different entities are related to one another and how they interact, especially when there are sort of overlapping individuals among these different entities. So that's something that we are working towards. Again, in our communication strategy, developing these roles and responsibilities not only for the Fed-only US, the AON board, as well as the Iarpic collaboration teams and sub-teams, including the data sub-team, but also a third sub-body that perhaps not a lot of folks may know about, include US AON tasks teams. So that's a third body that is mixed composition, feds and non-feds, that work towards developing requirements and implementation strategies around particular topics. In the past, there have been activities around sea ice, for example. The Arctic Report Card is another good example. And there are a few other activities that have been conducted and we plan to work on in the coming years. So aside from defining these relationships and the roles and responsibilities, that's something that we're working currently. And alongside that, I mentioned earlier, a communication strategy also that really builds on developing clear and consistent messaging and targeted across different audiences, whether we're talking sort of communicating internally to the US AON body and sub-bodies, or externally to international partners, different academic scientific research bodies, indigenous communities and organizations or other entities, ensuring that at the end of the day, we're able to really strengthen coordination of Arctic observing and data activities. And we also have a really excellent opportunity right now while we are developing the next 5-year Arctic research plan of Iarpic, ensuring that US AON and its sub-bodies are included in the different priority areas and foundational activities that will be drafted in the coming months. So I think I've provided a nice, well, I don't know if it's nice, I'll provide a brief overview of some of the current sort of organizational structure. Again, one of the key things going forward is a communication strategy that will really raise the profile and make it clear how these different entities, whether it is the NSF funding program that I manage at NSF, the interagency body, the collaboration teams through Iarpic, and the international SAON initiative, how these fit together to really bring about effective integrated Arctic observing platforms and data systems. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe there might be a few minutes to answer any burning questions before we move on to other components of the agenda.
Thank you, Roberto. That was a really well outlined set of pretty complicated information. And so there may be some questions from the group. As Roberto said, there's going to be some supporting materials coming out shortly that'll help visualize and support some of that, but certainly available for live questions as well. I don't see any hands raised, and I don't think we have any phone participants, phone-only participants today.
Just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. There's a button in the lower left-hand side of your screen, and the chat feature is now open again.
But there was a lot of information, and I think not a lot of time to go over it. But again, I think as we begin implementing our communication strategy, we'll have other materials and resources made available, likely on the Iarpic Collaboration's website, and potentially through other mechanisms for outreach, whether it's potentially a public webinar and additional efforts. Oh, I see Michael Brady.
So I appreciate that. I'll ask a question. This is Mike Brady, Iarpic Data Sub-Team Co-Lead. the terms of reference, I'm wondering about the process. I think that's, in addition to a document that outlines roles, responsibilities, objectives, goals, etc. It's also an opportunity to like get authority behind what you're doing and build a network, get buy-in from groups. So I'm wondering a little bit about the process of developing the tours and who's going to sign them, and what do you expect to get in terms of authority behind these tours?
Right. So that's an excellent question, Mike. Thank you for that. And at our last USA on board meeting last week, we in fact talked about what would be kind of the clearance or approval process. And so we are going to, I think, basically piggyback on sort of existing authorities that the Iarpic principles gave to us initially when the board was stood up. And at the very least, we'll be having some review and presentation to the Iarpic staff group. So it's a federal-only group at this point. Beyond that, I don't think we are required to have additional inputs. I don't know if Sandy would like to correct me or add any additional.
Yeah, no, our orientation towards the Iarpic, I think, is our most critical authority. But your point is well taken that. And it is one of the things that we recognized is that we have a lot of other types of documents that didn't quite get to the level of terms of reference, and that as we're hoping to engage more agencies in USAON or re-engage some who started with us but didn't continue with us, we thought it was timely to have something more formal that outlined the organization, and it's also helpful for just operating within OSTP. So as a sub-body of Iarpic, if we need to engage with the US Group on Earth Observations or US GCRP, it's helpful for us to have things well outlined so that people kind of see where this is coming from.
Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, well, I think our next couple items are probably going to fill in more around what Roberto presented, and then we'll also have time for more of a broad-ranging discussion at the
I had a
end.
quick question, actually.
Oh, please jump in.
Yeah, Bill Manley. So is USAN, quote, under SAON?
Yeah, so I can take that one, Roberto,
Okay,
if you want me
go ahead.
to.
Sure.
It is our U.S. body that officially is responsible for SAON engagement, but in terms of its sort of chartering, it's more directly chartered under the Iarpic. So one of the reasons for creating USAON is what Roberto referred to was this need for SAON to have national committees. And so it's one of our primary responsibilities to fulfill that role towards SAON, but we also have other national responsibilities and interagency responsibilities, and that's why we're chartered under the Iarpic.
Thanks.
And Sandy, if I may, I'll just add that. So among sort of those duties or responsibilities of the USAON as sort of the National Committee, Coordinating Committee for SAON, that involves representation on a number of levels. For example, Sandy's the chair of SAON at this point. Kathy Kuhn and I are national representatives. And so we tend to meet on the monthly basis for the SAON board meetings, provide input, comments, review of SAON activities. And the most recent example was the development of the roads framework, which Sandy will speak to later in the hour.
Great.
And one of the things I think we really want to underscore at this meeting, and we're going to create a specific distribution list just for this US National Committee to SAON meeting, is the National Committee to SAON is really you all who are here and at this meeting and who are contributing or have opportunities to contribute and support some of the things we're going to talk about. So I'll switch gears and jump into the roads presentation. I have to set a timer for myself because I'm using a new slide deck and I don't want to lose my lose my timing too much. And hopefully you'll see some good opportunities for engagement in what we're going to present here. And I am going to go straight into slideshow mode. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, they look good.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to share today, and we've talked about the roads process several times in the context of our Iarpic collaboration team meeting. This is really an update of what has developed since the Arctic Observing Summit. So we brought the process as drafted into the summit and engaged with all 5 of the Arctic Observing Summit working groups on what the opportunities were to improve the process, make it more inclusive, make it more logical, and to better support it. And so in the process, our drafting team, which is listed on the icon on the side of the screen, grew from about 12 original authors to a team of 24 authors. And we've just submitted some of these outcomes to a special journal issue of Arctic for the Arctic Observing Summit. And I think what I really want to underscore is that this is really becoming a shared, roads is becoming a shared process between SAON and the Arctic Observing Summit. So I'm not going to spend really any time on this slide due to time, but I do want to point out that what we're talking about for roads is addressing systemic issues, and that the reason we're creating this planning process is not to add layers into the planning. It's because we really saw a need for the tool. And I think we've seen this slide before also, but I think it's good to understand that roads come straight from SAON's 2018 to 2028 strategic plan, which called for it to create a roadmap under Goal 1 to promote free and ethically open access to Arctic data. And so that's the D in the roads process, is the data systems. And Goal 3 was ensuring sustainability of the Arctic systems. And so roads is really a tool to help us do all of these things, really with an emphasis on creating the shared understanding and the evidence base of what we need to make better investment decisions and more strategic partnerships and get more out of what we're doing. Roberto mentioned the SAON Arctic Societal Benefit Framework, which of course was sort of a starting point in our thinking for the roads process. And I think one of the really valuable outcomes from the Arctic Observing Summit, in particular from the Indigenous Knowledge and Food Security Working Group, was to emphasize that we need to consider other benefit frameworks, and that the way the thinking was developed in this benefit framework might not be representative of the way Indigenous communities are thinking about societal benefit. And so while we present this as a benefit framework for the roads process, it's not the exclusive benefit framework. But what is important is that we understand that we want to develop an observing network in support of shared societal benefit, rather than an observing network simply serving more limited needs that can sometimes be one of those systemic issues. Our road mapping task force outlined some guiding principles for the process, and we just have one addition to that. So as before, Indigenous peoples' equitable partnership and funding for their participation is really critical guiding principle for the quality of the roads process. We added a principle that all aspects of the process should support this broadly shared benefit. Our thinking all along, again, is not that we want to overrule or redo a lot of planning work that's already been done. We are trying to design a process so that the planning work that's already been done can come in and be shovel ready for the roads process, and that we can take advantage of the thinking. And that we hope that the partners in the process will be some of the networks that we already engage with. And also we recognize that we can't do everything at once. So a lot of the things you're going to see in the information that follows should underscore this idea that we're going to proceed with stepwise development and hopefully some good grassroots identification of our focal areas. So we have talked quite a bit about value tree assessment as being a really useful tool, but again, not an exclusive tool for understanding how to assess societal benefit within the process. So what we often see is there can feel like in insurmountable gap between the observing systems that we support and the societal benefits that we're trying to achieve. So I just chose 3 of the benefits from the benefit area framework. And so what we try to do in value tree assessment is to try to fill in the dots, or to really fill in the branches and the nodes in the tree by looking at things like intermediate data products and understanding how value passes forward and is added between these underlying observing systems and different types of data products. And then really crucial to value tree assessment is understanding these higher end applications that are providing a lot of the public services and information products that decision makers and the research community is using. And so through value tree analysis, we can create this systems level view of how these pieces fit together. And it helps us to understand up and downstream dependencies, where we're not getting enough value, where we're not meeting the objectives of our societal benefit areas, et cetera. And so a specific example focused on something like a gridded daily sea ice concentration product that came out of some of the analyses that USAN task teams have been working on that Roberto mentioned. What we see is a product like this is supported by things like passive microwave satellites and validated by sea ice drifting buoys. It's flowing forward to support indicators related to sea ice or primary productivity, and it's critical to the development of daily sea ice forecasts. So this kind of simple but specific example is the kind of information that we're trying to draw together through value tree analysis to better understand the landscape of what's out there. One thing that we know is that value tree analysis in and of itself does not help us meet all the goals of the roads process. For example, it doesn't help us structure our coordination very adequately. And so for that, one of the concepts that, again, we talked about in the context of the Arctic Observing Summit was initially essential Arctic variables, which then grew into this concept of shared Arctic variables. And what we learned from people at the summit, and what I think we were able to bring into the roads framework, was this idea that shared Arctic variables ideally are found at the intersection of all of these kind of big, important constituencies: regionally identified science and decision-making needs, Indigenous-led benefit identification, and essential variables of the global networks. And that they really provide a structured interface for us to document how we've translated societal requirements into observing system requirements, and what the implementation strategies are that are going to support those observing system requirements. As I said, ideally shared Arctic variables, these very high level types of things that are essential to characterizing the Arctic system, aspects of the Arctic system, either phenomena or processes, are found at the intersection of all 3 of these. But for the roads process, we find it sufficient if they're at the intersection of 2 of these sort of large constituencies, so that we can really drive this concept of shared benefit and cross-sectoral use of the same information and the same underlying observations. So thinking about, I mentioned the value tree assessment on its own doesn't sort of accomplish this bridging and connection, this kind of community of practice collaborative development that we need for specific topics. Shared Arctic variables are there to create this collaborative interface around specific initiatives. And we'll give some examples in a moment of what that looks like. So one point that we heard from the summit that I want to underscore here is that, especially amongst Indigenous participants, there's a high level of concern about siloing activities. And so shared Arctic variables, dividing the problem down into big buckets, even if the buckets are quite big, can still be pretty problematic. We still need to find ways to take a more integrated view of how things fit together. And for this, what we have spent a lot of time recently since the summit, we also had a mini workshop on this topic, was what an integrated advisory process might look like as we're stepping through the process of developing the specifications for our shared Arctic variables, so that we continue to weave things together in a way that's going to make sense. So I mentioned there's some things that we do in the development of shared Arctic variables that help turn them into the kind of collaborative structure we need. First is some form of assessment, like value tree assessment or other types of assessment systems. The second is translating those requirements for observing and keeping data management in there all along the way. And then the third is developing implementation strategies. And how we envision this proceeding is through expert groups. And we've talked about the expert groups in this forum before. And I'll provide a few examples of what those might look like. And I want to underscore these are just examples. I think we still need to put a lot of thinking into this. But critically, we're going to have a high-level advisory process at the SAON level that's really going to work to facilitate the integration. So let's walk through a couple examples of these foci. So one thing that came out of the summit was a desire to work regionally as experts on a bundle of variables. And that might look like what we heard about last time at our observing team meeting, the RNA co-ops, which is planning to work on issues related to well-being and food security in the Bering and adjacent seas. Another example is we might see thematic expert panels come forward to work under the roads process. An example might be something like the GoOn network, which is a global network working on ocean acidification, but we know we have a lot of work to do on this in the Arctic. And these dots are just indicating that people are going to step through the process and this is kind of a version of what we mean by stepwise facilitation. And then we also might see more issue-driven expert panels. And so a good example of this, I think, is the AMAP expert group on marine plastics really wanted to put some energy into a monitoring strategy. And we think that would be a good candidate for the process. And so what we're trying to show here is that the advisory process is really going to work to weaving things together that are related across different types of panels. And for example, it might even turn into a reorganization around a shared Arctic variable, shared Arctic variables related to the marine system. So that is the rundown on the roads process since the Arctic Observing Summit. And I'm sorry, I think I went a little long there. That's my bad for the new slides, but I'm happy to field questions on the process. And I'll leave the slides up just in case somebody has a question specific to one of the slides.
So Sandy, this is Molly. I'll ask a question here. Do you see, when you say regional, do you mean regional as like Alaska, US Arctic regional, or are you looking at it broader than that?
So I think Rachel Daniel is on the phone and she might want to speak to this because I think their thinking was a bit broader than that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I think it depends on the issue and the place. Like if you're thinking, I mean, you could be looking at the Northern Bering Sea, but then if you're working with a group of, and I think we've had some of these conversations at AOS, if you're thinking about some of the shared variables, then you're looking at, it might be pan-Arctic, right? And so I think it just depends on this, like the issue and the scale, but definitely, like, as you know, a lot of, the work that I'm doing is definitely Northern Bering related. And so that is one view that I have, but I think that there's, a whole number of other folks that that I'm also interested in how, that might translate, across different places based on, similar cultural values. And so that, I don't know if that answers your question.
She looks
Yeah.
happy with the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the situation and yeah, the issue and all. Thanks, Rachel.
Any other immediate questions on the process? Because we're going to have more time during our full discussion at the end as well.
Sandy, it looks like Bill Manley has his hand raised.
Yes, so I
Okay.
have a question, and I'm guessing that Peter Pulsifer will touch on this more, but I would encourage steps 1 and 2 in particular to take advantage of recent progress towards interoperability in the data world, and particularly with use of semantic technologies, controlled vocabularies, persistent identifiers, and not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah,
In
thanks,
particular,
Bill.
to be able to crosswalk or map among essentially the same variable across numerous systems.
Yep, thank you. One of the things that came out of our workshop on the advisory panel process was the need to have some of the real high level thinkers in the data community be part of that advisory panel. And one of the responsibilities of the advisory panel will be to make sure that the right people are engaged in these efforts under these expert panels. So that, there should be data managers, there should be end users, there should be all different kinds of people coming together and defining these shared variables so that we get something that's going to be broadly useful in the way that we see. Another point to underscore here is we really think that this process is ripe for a lot of proposal-driven action. A lot of the expert panels are going to probably be operating at the scope of that's consistent with a proposal-driven effort. And we hope that the descriptions we've provided are going to be helpful to groups in their thinking about what they might want to bring forward. So that gets at the grassroots part of this, and this idea that you, the body of people on this phone call, are the National Committee for SAON in our view. And so we're really hoping to see some activity from that front in support of the process.
Great.
Looks like Hayo also has his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. This was great, Sandy. I really appreciate it. Kind of a really nice sort of consolidated summary of what's all happening. The question I have is related to the fact that SAON is international. It's pan-Arctic and includes a lot of non-Arctic countries who are starting to buy into the broader concept. But if there's any thoughts from you or others on the call here, I see we have a couple of Canadian colleagues on and maybe from other countries as well, as to how we can foster or sort of collaboratively move progress on these issues forward across a number of different countries. That's what I see as a bit of a challenge, because there's a lot of thought that's going into all of this, but that also makes the entry barrier higher for countries or researchers or government employees in those countries who want to be part of this process. So I don't know whether you have thoughts on that. I know you've thought about it quite a bit, and it's a tough question, but if there's others here, I noticed Scott Harper's on here. I'm wondering whether ONR operates internationally, have an office in Asia, whether there's ways that we could leverage some of these connections with other agencies who have strong international ties, even if it's just one of the SAON member or Arctic countries. Any thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thanks.
I'm happy to let Scott take that. I think Hayo's probably heard my view enough.
Yeah, well, I don't know what to say. We certainly have ONR has a global office, and we do a lot of partnership with foreign PIs in other countries. Usually you've got some sort of a scientific connection with a USPI, and we have a specific program set up called NICOP, which will even fund the foreign PI to to collaborate with the USPIs on some sort of science program. So we can certainly look at those sorts of efforts. Usually it's an ONR funded person in the US or someone from the Naval Research Laboratory. But if we were in an interagency partnership with other groups that were funding USPIs, I could certainly advocate for using that NICOP program to forge an international collaboration on a larger program, even if they were, say, working with an NSF funded person, funded under Roberto's program or something like that. So there are those sorts of efforts. I mean, ONR can actually fund foreign PIs directly if we thought that there was some sort of benefit for the U.S. part when we're talking about the regional observations. We've worked with partners in Norway for the thermometry, for example, that just took place in a program called KTEX across the North Pole, trying to understand temperature changes, in the interior of the water column across the Arctic Ocean, with PIs from Norway. We regularly fund people from the UK for sea ice research and things of that nature. So we can certainly help be a conduit for making those international connections, because we do have international offices and we can actually fund international partners directly.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful, and that might be an avenue to pursue further, because those types of relationships, in particular with, I can imagine, Japan, Korea, there might be good collaborations between U.S. researchers and government agencies even, and their partners in those Asian countries. Thanks, Scott.
This is Larry. Can I jump in? Larry Hinsman. Can I jump in with a comment too, please?
Yes, please.
So it is interesting to think about, where this all started, in that, several years ago, we in SAON recognized that we all really wanted to see international observing networks, but it was going to be hard to reach those because each nation has their own priorities and their own goals and activities. And so it was more likely that we should be pushing in the direction of creating connectivity among these various networks, and so we could try and build towards that effort. And that's kind of where the ROADS process got its start. And actually, there was a SAON board meeting this morning, and in the board meeting, SAON really does appreciate the national committee, such as USAON, and SAON is encouraging other nations to develop similar programs and move forward in that similar steps. And in the board meeting this morning, the executive secretary of SAON, we did ask for reports from nations that do have observing committees. Unfortunately, we ran out of time and didn't get to that. But one of the questions that Jan René Larsen put forward to the various nations is, how are they moving forward to implement the ROADS process? And I think that was just a critically important statement. And so if we can get all of the nations who are involved in Arctic observing to get aligned with this ROADS process, get our focus in towards a similar endpoint and to a similar process of moving forward, we can build those connections among the various networks and among the priorities that we are observing. And so I think, Hayo, I think you're really hitting it on the head. That is an approach that we can take forward to help us reach that ultimate objective. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Larry. That was a great response to Hayo's question. We should move on, and thanks to everyone for your questions. If you have to save them till the discussion, we should move on to Peter's presentation now and updates on the Arctic Data Committee and other activities. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Sandy, and thanks all. I'll try and move through this quickly so we have some time for discussion. So I'm just going to provide a pretty high-level overview of some of the Arctic and polar data community activities and how they might intersect with Iarpic in particular. Just at the highest level, I think what we've seen in the last 12, 14 years is the development of a community, a really persistent, well-engaged data community. And this came in large part, I think, from the International Polar Year
and it has lived beyond the International Polar Year. It's a socio-technical system, so it's not just the hardware and the data, but it's lots of people and organizations and logos, as you see here. So a lot has been happening. We're not where we want to be, but we're getting there, I think, much more quickly than we were before the IPY. Some work that's been happening and trying to understand this system, and I won't go into all of the details, but developing some models and some tools and collecting data along with a whole bunch of different partners. That's trying to understand, who the actors are, who the different organizations, how they're working together or not working together, and so on. Put together a chapter on this that you see there, but really, if you think about it as an ecosystem, people often throw that out as a term, but don't always think, what does that actually mean? This talks a little bit about that and this idea that, if you look at it as an ecosystem, it does have some of the characteristics of the ecosystem, the idea of keystone species, these entities in the community that are really critical to its survival and maintaining a healthy ecosystem. So we have to think about that when we're thinking about, where we put our energies, where we put our funding, and so on. And a big part as well is that it's not just, as I said, technical nodes, but it's a whole bunch of people. And we have to think about that and how do we bring those people together. Ideally, once COVID is behind us, we can do that again in person, but I'll come back to this later. Even now, we can really keep moving forward in a virtual way. One of the things touched on in that chapter is not really a technical thing at all, but it's how we think about planning, how we think about moving forward with the development of communities and how that happens. And so there's a book in particular that I referenced that looks at the internet as a technology-based ecosystem. And it points out that the older sort of rational classical models of putting together your objectives and then moving forward through a linear process really break down to a great extent when you're thinking about these new emergent, highly dynamic and volatile systems. And so we see that when we see the development of various online platforms and so on. So it's not to say that the older model has no value. It's just we have to think about how we adapt to these new realities. And so Sandy often talks about the idea of polycentric governance, and I think it relates to that kind of thing as well, as how do we work in this complicated space that is not a single organization or even a single discipline. And thinking about relationships, I won't go into the details of holons and things like that, but it's just this idea that there are all these whole part relationships. So we think about these things as a system, but there are all kinds of other interrelated systems, and they're sort of part of each other. So that seems a bit esoteric, but we run into it every single day, I think, in our activities when we get down into the actual weeds of how do we develop these systems. And so we do need to think about it, and we need to think about it with everybody, not just the technicians and not just the data people. Policy and governance comes up again and again. So there's activity around that's happening right now, actually, as part of a paper development process where we're looking at different policies led by Stein Tronstad, who is both with the Antarctic and Arctic data communities. How do we take what we see from these various national and international policies and ensure that we get the best out of those. But there are challenges. It's complicated. The long tail issue is that many of the data streams, if you will, or the data feeds are not coming from official government or corporate entities or programs. They're coming from individual researchers on soft money and so on. And so, how do you fit that into the policy framework? It's not quite as simple as saying, hey, it's just about getting a particular government agency and saying, here's the policy directive. And there's all kinds of things ranging from norms to international treaties that fall into this space of policy. So this is something that we're paying attention to, but certainly needs attention as we figure all of these things out. And that, I think, links directly with what Sandy's talking about, going forward with the roads process. Indigenous knowledge and information systems certainly comes up a lot. It came up a lot in the previous two talks as well. But here there are a lot of actual systems that are being developed. Unfortunately, not all of them are stable, and they don't necessarily have long-term funding, but they're an important part of the overall ecosystem, and one that we need to consider, I think, very explicitly. And then also think about things like, who's engaging and who's leading those efforts, and making sure that that's done appropriately. So the next point I'll just speak on is just how can the Iarpic data team support international activities where their interests align. And so some of them activities could just simply be with these larger international initiatives that are not specific to the Arctic or the polar regions. Research Data Alliance is a good example. It's a huge amount of activity going on now. You'll see now they're up to over 11,000 members. So many different working groups, and they're producing a lot of really good recommendations. They're not really a standards body, but they are very practical, and they provide really good discussion, guidance, and so on. The Open Geospatial Consortium, anybody working in spatial data is probably aware of them, groups like Geo and so on. So if nothing else, if you're engaging in that and being productive there, it will trickle down and it'll have an impact on what we're doing within the Arctic community. There are some very specific activities though going on, events. So the Polar Data Forum series, we're now up to the 3rd Polar Data Forum. The first one was held in Tokyo in 2013, thanks in great part to NIPR and our colleagues in Japan. A second in Waterloo, Canada, and in partnership with the University of Colorado in 2015, and then one last fall. And we're now looking towards September 2021, and we're just about to confirm that as the next Polar Data Forum. So this has evolved from initially just a conference style meeting where it was just presentations over a couple of days and a statement. We've now morphed it into one where it's a couple of days of conference style, and the one in Helsinki, there were 3 days of hackathons. So actual, rolling up the sleeves. We had software developers and so on there, sitting down and working together through some of the challenges that we're facing. Similarly, in terms of bringing the community together, the Arctic Observing Summit, particularly Working Group 4 under the Arctic Observing Summit. So we're bringing these things together into a nice, what I'll call chain of activities. So typically, the Polar Data Forum was a few months before the last Arctic Observing Summit that was held at the end of March. So we used Helsinki as a way to prepare for Arctic Observing Summit. We'll now use AOS outputs to feed into other things. And specifically, something that came out of both the Polar Data Forum and the AOS was our conversations around needing to work together more frequently, and also to be very practical and continue this idea of hackathons. So we now have a series that started on June 30th. And so what I and others did was put together the idea of, let's in a way take advantage of the situation we find ourselves in with the COVID era, and bring ourselves together, use the technology to make progress. So we started, I think we're averaging about 60 to 70 people online every 2 months. And we have a number of themes. The first theme is a combination of thinking about federated search, how we actually bring catalogs together and enhance data discovery. And combined with that are discussions that Bill touched on, semantics. What are the vocabularies, the terminology, and so on that's being used? How do we map that out? How do we mediate it, and so on, in a way that can enhance interoperability, as well as just reduce a lot of duplication. And then the other part I've already touched on is the policy work that we're doing. So those are the things that we're focusing on in this hackathon series right now. But what we're looking at doing is making this a persistent activity, even beyond COVID, and ensuring that it keeps us together in between the in-person meetings. So engaging with SAON specifically through the Arctic Data Committee. The Arctic Data Committee it's a joint committee of IASC and SAON. It was formed in late 2014. And at the time, I think the idea was that there was just a relatively small number of entities that were engaged in this type of work, and we would come together. And since then, we've realized that, the system is much larger. You saw some of the visualizations, all the different organizations. So what Arctic Data Committee has been focusing on is really, providing the platform for discussion and engagement. It doesn't have the resources to actually, take on all of the work, or even a lot of it, but it is providing that international platform, and we feel that it's been fairly successful at doing that. But we're at this transition phase now, where we're moving from what was kind of a committee and advisory and a little bit of coordination into something that is becoming more active. And so we're trying to work and figure out how do we transition into a much more active body and collaborative of different organizations. A very practical item for this meeting is that I have been the US representative to that committee since late 2014. But I'll be stepping down in that position. I will retain a position on the committee, but I've changed my primary affiliation, and I'm now based in Canada, so I'll be a Canadian representative going forward. So we are looking to fill that position. So if you or somebody you think might be interested and active there, we'd look to you to fill that position. I'll just wrap up by saying that, even beyond formally engaging in the activities of the data committee or the other entities, this comes out of the Polar Data and Systems Architecture Workshop that we held late in 2018 after the NSF funded Polar Data Planning Summit. And really there we had a number of different statements that we made about, how do we want to move forward as a community? And a couple of them are, leverage existing successful programs. So just when you're developing something, if you're developing resources or infrastructure and so on, reach out just enough to say, hey, at least, can you make it compliant? Can you engage in the process in some way, even if it's not, your raison d'etre or your core activity? And then also when you're writing proposals, think about, writing in some resources, if not to develop things, but even to engage in meetings, to attend meetings, travel funding, and so on, so that we can have more people around the table to keep this moving. So I'm going to leave it there and say thank you. And there are a couple of email addresses there if you want to contact me directly, but we can continue with our conversation now.
Great, thank you, Peter. I wanted to remind people we give ourselves an extra 15 minutes for this call. So the discussion period at the end is with that extra 15 minutes if you're feeling nervous about the time. I know some people probably had to leave at the top of the hour. Are there any direct questions for Peter?
Andy, your audio was breaking up.
Is it better now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, I just asked if I was reminding people that we had an extra 15 minutes for this meeting, and that's going to be our discussion time, and if we would start with direct questions for Peter. So if there's no direct questions for Peter, we can talk about our general discussion question here. And I would in particular like to hear from those of you who are in the broader research community and maybe in positions to lead on proposals or following the example of the RNA proposal that was led by Hayo Aiken, to think about how we as the US committee, how we can strengthen the US committee concept to best support SAON and other international engagements. Peter gave a long list of them there and also underscored this idea, particularly with all the work that's been done on the Arctic Data Committee. A lot of this has been done on a voluntary basis. And we recognize that people are going to need funding, in particular, Indigenous engagement in these activities is going to require funding. And so just kind of opening the floor to everyone to talk about how we can kind of better solidify our concept as a national committee and support these efforts, and maybe through proposal-driven efforts. Thanks.
Sandy, this is Molly. Could you clarify what part of this process is federal only and what part is kind of the broader community?
Yeah, so the part that Roberto started with at the beginning outlined some of those pieces. The only Fed only part of what we're describing here is the USA on board. And so that's playing an advisory capacity and guiding the work that, for example, Hazel and I do directly in terms of developing coordination. Sally McFarland sits both on the board and on the observing collaborations team, so she carries some water back and forth as well. But everything else about the USA on concept is really an open collaboration, as exemplified by the collaboration website. And even, when we do initiate a task team, it's often initiated by an agency, but we can bring feds and non-feds together under our tasks.
Yeah, this is Bill Manley again. I have a question for Peter. So have there been any specific thoughts yet about how the SAN Arctic Data Committee can interrelate with the SAN Roads process in terms of, in particular semantics for shared Arctic variables? Maybe in the Polar to Global work hackathons.
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. So by definition, the ADC is part of the roads process because we're a committee of SAON. But I think where the role that we want to play is to help facilitate identification of the people that we need around the table. This came up actually a great deal at Arctic Observing Summit as well, is, who do we need to have at that table? Who are the experts in the field? How do we ensure that, we're having the right conversations, that we're advising, in terms of what's already there, what the gaps are, and so on. So as roads continues, one of the things I'll be bringing up at the November 5th meeting is exactly that point, is that we'll be, making a call out to the community for particular expertise. And similarly, I'd like to be thinking about how we coordinate more amongst the various entities. So there's IASA and Arctic Data Committee. There's also Global Cryosphere Watch. There's GEO. There's many others. All those acronyms and logos. And we're thinking more about a federated organizational approach to ensure that we're not just drawing from one of those communities because there's a lot of expertise across the many organizations.
Awesome.
And you're on the list, Bill.
Can I pull on that thread a little bit, Peter?
Sure.
About federated activities like that, what type of governance structures are gluing that federation together? Because individual countries and projects are held to their own mandates and their own funding agencies. At the same time, you want to gain critical mass and commitments, and it's a curious balance. And I'm working with that in other areas too. And there's a couple of models out there, and I think we're going to be floating a couple of new models next June at ICRI in Toronto.
Great.
The International Conference on Research Infrastructures.
Yeah, that's a great question, Hank. And I think what we've seen to date is this has been more of the emergent grassroots approach. With very, people are not even wanting to call it governance because there are no mandates. As I said, I can't tell this group to do that and so on. This is where I'm really looking forward to engaging in the roads process and roads and related. So the Arctic Science Ministerial process and others to think about that as a community. And one of my slides where I said, think about those new models that might work because it's really taken us to a point where I think it's hard to know how to move forward. Because we're getting into things like, hey, let's agree on a standard. And it's fine if I say from my lab, I'm going to do that. But if I'm trying to say on behalf of a government or even, a part of government, I have to have more than that. And that implies some sort of governance structure. And that's what we currently lack. And in a way, it's sort of above the pay grade, if you will, of a lot of the people in our community who are data managers and maybe even lab leads. But it's something that has to be in place. So I'm really looking forward to engaging in that part of the process because I think it's that transition I talked about that we need to go into that space.
Well, we've got some models that we're moving forward across federating other environmental research infrastructures, as you know, and there's lessons learned there too. So it'd be great to work with you on that.
Great, and I would say that should be all part of this collective. So we're also not just thinking about the data system, because I think a lot of this applies to the observing system and all the other systems and those hold-ons I talked about.
We have time for more questions, and if people also want to include a community update, this time can be used for both. Yeah, Mary Beth.
Thanks, Sandy. I just wanted to speak to the Hayo's comments and then Larry's comments about international representation. I can tell this group that we have actually started a conversation here in Canada about how to move forward on a national committee on networks, which I'm very pleased about because it's been radio silence here for quite some time. But we're seeing renewed engagement from federal collaborators as well as academic types like myself and Peter and others. So hopefully Canada will be coming forward with some coordination and organization here in the next few months. I just wanted to let everybody know about that.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Okay, well, it seems like we've maybe run out of questions for the time being. If there's aspects of the concept of the national committee model that still remain elusive, or our governance for US AON, as Roberto mentioned, we're working on preparing a couple foundational documents for the public that I think will be helpful. I hope will be helpful. And as always, I think Roberto, Peter, and myself are always available for comments via email, or you can use the comment section from the meeting itself to post a comment if you want the entire group to be able to see it and respond to it. Hazel, do you have a readout for what our next observing team call is? And then maybe we'll ask the data team to share what their next data team call is.
I believe the observing team is working on a joint meeting with the physical oceanography team, details and date to be confirmed, possibly as soon as November 5th. But stay posted for details on that. And if someone from the data team, Michael or Jonathan or Anne, would like to share your next data meeting.
Hi, thanks. This is Mike Brady, and I may ask Anne to verify the dates. So I do know the next call we have is 29 October. We have an NGA researcher updating on new methods for sea ice mapping. And we also have a presentation following that one from the U.S. National Ice Center on an overview of the National Ice Center and also their collaboration and how the tight connection between the National Ice Center and the research being done really has impact on decision support outcomes in the Arctic. So that's 29 October, 1 p.m. Eastern. And Jonathan, do you want to update on the November meeting? We're not gonna have a call in December due to the holiday schedule. And Jonathan, you on the line still, or? So November 24, I believe, and I have to confirm that that's the date. We have a social scientist presentation on big data, basically managing, applying technology to manage privacy and access concerns to inform data management protocol in the Arctic. And I'm not leading that call, so I don't have the full background on that. I would look to the website for updates on that call in November. That's my update. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And to the and to our speakers today, Roberto and Peter. We will look forward with reconnecting with you all soon. Thanks for joining us.